Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We're expecting a great turnout today, so we're going to hold just for a moment to give people a chance to join, and then we'll get right into it. All right, let's get started. Welcome to part one of the new NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy webinar series. Today, we're focusing on understanding the new DMS policy. I'm going to talk just for a moment about some logistics and some formats for today's event. Today's session will include a pre-recorded discussion with our expert panel, followed by about 30 minutes of live Q&A from our audience. Several of you submitted questions in advance of the webinar, and we've incorporated many of those into our panel discussion. During the 30-minute live Q&A, we will get to as many additional questions as we can. Some logistics to go over with you all. While the pre-recorded discussion is playing, we invite you to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So that's what we're going to be monitoring. Our team will be compiling these questions and asking as many as we can during the live Q&A part of the event. You all will actually have the opportunity to upvote some of these questions. There's a little thumbs up icon that'll show up next to a question. And you go ahead and upvote any questions that you also feel are very important, and that'll help us prioritize which questions to handle in the live Q&A portion. We're also offering a chat box to communicate with the hosts and panelists if you have technical or logistical issues during the event. Put your comment in the chat and we'll be able to help you out. Our team will actually also be using the chat to chat out some links during the event to some important resources that we want you to know about. One tip, there is a small arrow next to the chat button in your Zoom webinar, and this will allow you to toggle on and off your chat notifications. So just a tip, if you want to see those notifications or not, you can control that. Finally, I did want to mention that the entire session will be recorded and will be made available following today's event, probably within about 5 to 7 business days. We've also put together some resource slides that are available on the NIH sharing site. This is sharing.nih.gov/about/learning. And in the chat, we're going to actually put a direct link to that resource deck. But that's just something that we also wanted you to have as part of this event. All right. Before we introduce our main panelists for today, we have a special welcome from Dr. Lyric Jorgenson, the Acting Associate Director for Science Policy at NIH.
Hello, I'm Lyric Jorgenson, the Acting Associate Director for Science Policy at the National Institutes of Health. I'd like to welcome you all to the first webinar of our 2-part series, A Conversation with NIH, Implementing the New Data Management and Sharing Policy. The webinar you're tuning into today, Understanding the New NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy, will provide an introduction to many of the important basics of the policy. The second webinar in our series, taking place on September 22nd, 2022, will take a deeper dive into the nuances of the policy, so please make sure to tune into that one as well. Just as a brief reminder, the NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy was issued on October 29th, 2020, and goes into effect January 25th, 2023. It is important to note that the policy was developed through substantial and consistent consultation with the research community, tribal nations, our federal partners, and many other experts and stakeholders engaged along the way. The 2-year delay in implementation was indeed deliberate. We wanted to make certain that our timeline here is ambitious, but also take into consideration the need to develop additional resources for implementation and provide institutions with the time they need to get ready to be successful. We've been busy since 2020, taking advantage of this time to present at dozens of meetings, seminars, and other venues to get the word out to stakeholders about this policy. If you've heard one of those previous presentations on the policy, either from me or one of my colleagues here at NIH, you've probably heard us use the phrase culture shift. You may even be thinking, what exactly do we mean? Simply put, we want to make practices of data management and responsible data sharing the norm. That is, consider routine to the conduct of science itself, just as reporting out on the findings of a study. Through this new policy, we aim to catalyze this culture shift. The core principle embedded in the policy is maximizing the availability of scientific data resulting from taxpayer-funded research. This will be achieved in part by prospectively planning for data sharing through the submission of a data management and sharing plan with applications for the research funding. By maximizing the availability of scientific data, we all can work together to enable researchers to rigorously test the validity of research findings, strengthen analyses through combined data sets, allow for the reuse of hard-to-generate data, open new and exciting frontiers of discovery, and perhaps most importantly to me, help foster trust in publicly funded research activities by promoting research transparency. With all of that said, we must be realistic and recognize that challenges in beliefs and practices takes time. We realize that some researchers may already have significant experience in planning for how to share data, while others, well, this might be new practice. We are working to make implementation as smooth as possible, but we know there will be challenges. Flexibility and patience will be key as we move forward with implementation. If and when issues do arise, I want to reassure you all that NIH will work through them with you as partners in the process. For NIH's part, we will continue to develop additional resources based on the needs of the community, so keep asking for the help. Resources to be on the lookout for in the future include final supplemental information on protecting the privacy of research participants when data are shared, and final supplemental information on responsible management and sharing of American Indian and Alaska Native participant data. I want to thank you all once again for joining us today for today's webinar. We look forward to continuing to work with you all, and I hope you find this as just one of many valuable resources as you prepare for the NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy. Thank you very much for your time.
The January 25th policy implementation date is quickly approaching, and we know that you have a lot of questions. We have an expert panel here today to help you better understand the policy and what it means for you. My name is Elise Sullivan, and I will be moderating today's event. Joining us from the Office of Science Policy, we have Taunton Payne, and from the Office of Extramural Research, we have Julia Slutzman and Cindy Danielson. Today's discussion will cover the goals of the policy, what types of data are subject to it, and the expectations of the policy itself. We will then move into discussing how to prepare DMS plans and budgeting for related costs. Finally, we'll discuss the timing of when data should be shared and some factors to consider when selecting data repositories. We've chosen these topics based on the most common questions that we've heard from researchers, institutional officials, and other groups. And we plan to cover additional topics in part 2 of this webinar series, which is coming in September. So with that, I will turn my first question to Taunton. Can you start by summarizing the goals of the policy for us?
Thanks, Elise. Dr. Jorgenson provided an excellent overview of the reasons why NIH developed this policy. NIH has a long-standing commitment to make results of research available, including both publications and data. In fact, NIH has had data sharing policies for decades that have grown incrementally over time to cover a substantial portion of NIH's portfolio of research. These policies have focused on setting expectations for sharing data from large awards, from genomic studies, and for research funded by specific NIH institutes, centers, or programs. The NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy will create a consistent minimum expectation for all research supported by the agency. Sharing data can help to, as Dr. Jorgenson mentioned, enable researchers to test the validity of research findings and foster trust in publicly funded research activities by promoting transparency. Fundamentally, the goal of the policy is to increase the availability of data underlying NIH-supported research, and in so doing, to help advance NIH's mission to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability.
And can you help us understand what types of research this new policy applies to?
The NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy applies to all research funded or conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. Let's start by looking at the definition of scientific data, which the policy defines as the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. These scientific data are also what we ask researchers to address sharing.
All right, well, how about some examples of scientific data?
The exact scope of scientific data will vary depending on the context, but it will relate to the aims and the questions of the proposed research. As very general examples, the scientific data for a study of HIV/AIDS might include single-cell RNA sequencing of T lymphocytes or other immune cells. The study of a rodent model of PTSD might include electrophysiological recordings and functional MRI images. And a study of cardiovascular health might include step activity from a wearable device.
So now, can you talk about what types of things are not scientific data?
It's important to understand that the definition of scientific data explicitly excludes certain things, which means that they would not be expected to be shared. These include data that are not necessary for or of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings, laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, completed case report forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews, communications with colleagues, or any kind of physical objects, such as specimens. This policy also does not apply to administrative data associated with awards and does not expect sharing of software or code developed from a study, although NIH has issued best practices for when software and code are shared. Under this policy, researchers are responsible for identifying their scientific data. No one is in a better position to understand the scientific data generated during your research than you all.
Thanks, Taunton. Can you walk us through what types of NIH-funded activities are going to be subject to this new policy?
In terms of the types of activities that will be subject to the policy, the scope includes research funded or conducted by extramural grants, contracts, intramural research projects, and other funding agreements such as other transactions. The policy applies regardless of the level of funding. However, there are certain activities that are just excluded entirely from the scope of the policy. This includes research and other activities that do not generate scientific data, including training, infrastructure development, and any non-research activities. Projects that only develop or support infrastructure resources and do not generate findings or scientific data, such as establishing repositories, are not subject to the policy. NIH will provide a list of relevant activity codes to help understand what's in and what's out of the scope of the policy.
Okay, let's talk about the timing of when the policy goes into effect.
The policy will take effect for competing grant applications that are submitted to NIH for the January 25th, 2023 and subsequent receipt dates. Proposals for contracts that are submitted to NIH on or after January 25th, 2023 will also need to comply with the policy, as will NIH intramural research projects conducted on or after January 25th, 2023, and other funding agreements such as other transactions that are executed on or after January 25th, 2023, unless otherwise stipulated by NIH.
Okay, so we covered policy applicability and the timing of the policy. Taunton, in a nutshell, what does this policy actually expect from investigators and institutions?
So the policy is straightforward in that it only has two basic requirements. First, it requires the submission of a data management and sharing plan, which will be included with each application for funding and will generally describe how, where, and when data will be shared. Second, once the plan is approved by the funding NIH Institute, Center, or office, the policy requires compliance with that plan, which will be achieved by making it a term and condition of award. Of course, plans may be updated over the course of the award, which we'll talk about more later.
And a common misconception that we hear is that the policy requires all data to be shared. Taunton, can you help clarify this?
As I mentioned before, the policy only requires submission of a data management and sharing plan and compliance with the version of the plan approved by the NIH Institute, Center, or office funding the research. It does not require data sharing. However, it does expect that in developing their data management and sharing plans, researchers will maximize appropriate sharing of scientific data. So no, the policy does not require or expect that all data generated during the course of a study be shared. Under the policy, researchers have the responsibility to determine both what constitutes their scientific data and to propose how they will maximize appropriate sharing of those scientific data, including identifying scientific data that will not be shared, and they should provide justifications for these decisions. Remember that a number of things are excluded from the definition of scientific data and thus are not expected to be shared. In particular, any data that are not necessary for or of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings. The policy emphasizes that all data should be managed, but recognizes that not all data must or even can be shared.
Thanks. And can you talk us through some of the factors that may limit how data can be shared?
Yes. I want to point out that while the policy expects researchers to maximize appropriate sharing of scientific data, it also recognizes that in order for sharing to be appropriate, there are justifiable ethical, legal, and technical factors that may limit sharing of scientific data in some way, or in some cases preclude sharing entirely. In the frequently asked questions on the sharing.nih.gov website, we've provided a number of potential examples of these factors that would be appropriate for limiting sharing. And these include when informed consent will not permit or will limit the scope or extent of sharing and future research use, or when working with previously collected biospecimens or data, existing consent prohibits or limits the scope of sharing and use. Relatedly, I would like to mention that NIH has recently issued a resource providing points to consider and sample language for informed consent in research studies with plans to store and share data or biospecimens for future use that may be helpful when thinking about consent in this context.
Thanks. And Taunton, we get a lot of questions about privacy and safety concerns with sharing. Can you speak to this?
Sharing can also be limited if the privacy or safety of research participants would be compromised or place them at greater risk of re-identification or suffering harm, and if protective measures such as de-identification and certificates of confidentiality would be insufficient to mitigate these risks. NIH has proposed a set of considerations for protecting privacy when sharing data from research participants to help guide researchers and institutions in making these decisions, and we'll be expanding more on this in future resources.
And what about if laws or regulations prohibit sharing?
Of course, sharing must be limited when there are explicit federal, state, local, or tribal laws, regulations, or policies that prohibit or limit disclosure in some way. Nothing in this policy changes the expectation that researchers abide by other requirements that may apply to them. For example, the Common Rule, the HIPAA Privacy Rule, state laws, or even foreign laws that may limit sharing of some types of data. There may also be restrictions imposed on sharing by existing or anticipated agreements that may be necessary to enter into in order to conduct the research. For example, with third-party funders, with research partners, with repositories, or with HIPAA-covered entities that provide protected health information under a data use agreement. There may also be limitations imposed through licensing limitations attached to materials needed to conduct the research. Last, I want to emphasize that we've clarified through a frequently asked question that the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Program Policy Directive permits SBIR and STTR awardees to withhold applicable data for 20 years after the award date, as stipulated in the specific SBIR STTR funding agreement and consistent with achieving program goals.
Thanks, Taunton. So are there any other factors that we should discuss when it comes to limitations on data sharing?
We also recognize that researchers commonly access existing data to conduct their research, for example, analyzing data obtained from a data repository. And although some of these primary data might reasonably fall within the definition of scientific data in some cases, NIH would not expect that data that are already available be shared again. I also want to point out that NIH recognizes and respects tribal sovereignty and the concerns that American Indian and Alaska Native communities sometimes have regarding data management and sharing, and NIH has also proposed additional considerations for when researchers are working with tribes that we'll be addressing in more detail in the future. A central tenet of these proposed considerations is to facilitate respectful partnership and mutually agreed upon data management and sharing practices, which may ultimately require limitations on sharing in some cases. Now, these are examples of factors that would clearly be appropriate for limiting sharing, and it's not a comprehensive list. There may be others that we encounter in practice, and NIH may update guidance accordingly in the future.
Thanks. Can you give us some examples of reasons that would not be considered justifiable reasons to limit sharing?
We've provided a few examples of factors that NIH would generally not find acceptable for limiting sharing, and these include arguments that data are too small, that researchers anticipate data will not be widely used, or if data are not thought to have a suitable repository.
Thank you. All right, let's switch gears and get to talking about DMS plans. Cindy, can you talk to us about how to go about preparing these plans and what they should include?
Thanks, Elise. Definitely a great question to dig into. When the final policy was issued back in October of 2020, NIH also put out supplemental policy information describing the elements we'd like to see in a data management and sharing plan, or DMS plan. This was published as an NIH guide notice, and we've also incorporated this information into the NIH Scientific Data Sharing website at sharing.nih.gov to make it easy to find all of the relevant information in one place. Let's talk through each of these elements. First, data type. You should provide information about the data type or types you're proposing to generate in your project and identify which of those will be preserved and shared. This will not include all data generated, but should focus on the scientific data underlying the proposed research findings. As Taunton mentioned, what exactly those data are will vary by project, so researchers will need to define this individually based on the research proposal. Next, related tools, software, and code. You should indicate what tools or software will be needed to access and manipulate your data. Next, standards. This is where you'll describe what common data standards will be applied to your scientific data and metadata to enable interoperability of datasets. Next, data preservation, access, and associated timelines. This element is where you'll indicate your plans to preserve data and provide access to shared data, including timelines. This includes the name of the repository or repositories you propose to use to archive your scientific data and metadata, whether persistent unique identifiers will be used to facilitate findability and accessibility of shared data, and when and for how long shared data will be available. Next, access, distribution, or reuse considerations. Any factors that affect data access, distribution, or reuse should be described. NIH expects that researchers maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data, but as Taunton just described, there may be certain ethical, legal, and technical factors that could limit the extent of data sharing. NIH wants to know what these are before any data have been generated, so that the proposed institute or center can assess whether your plan appropriately considers these factors. This section is also where, for research that involves the sharing of scientific data generated from human research participants, you should indicate whether access to such data will be controlled, that is, made available by a data repository only after approval, and outline how privacy, rights, and confidentiality of human research participants will be protected. Finally, oversight of data management and sharing. This is where you will indicate how compliance with your DMS plan will be monitored and managed within your institution, and who at your institution will be responsible for this oversight. You can find more details about these elements on the Writing a Data Management and Sharing Plan section of NIH's Sharing website.
Thanks, Cindy. Is there a recommended format for these plans?
In terms of the format, we recommend that DMS plans should be 2 pages or less. And while we've had this detailed information about the elements of a DMS plan available for some time to help researchers and organizations begin thinking about the content of their DMS plans, we have heard a lot of feedback that a template would be helpful, especially for those who've never written a plan like this before. In response to this feedback, NIH will be offering an optional format page that applicants can use as a template to format the elements of their DMS plans. We have made available a preview of that format page or template, which I'll bring up now. This is currently a draft version, which is undergoing OMB clearance under the Paperwork Reduction Act. And when that process is complete, the final version of the document will be posted in a fillable format. The goal of this format page is to help investigators address all of the elements while still providing the flexibility to write a plan that works best for each project. You'll notice that the information here aligns with the same elements that I just described: data type, related tools, software and code, standards, data preservation, access and associated timelines, access, distribution or reuse considerations, and oversight of data management and sharing. We've just broken them up into a few sections to make it easier to address each aspect.
Thanks, Cindy. So now that we know about plans and what they should include, can you tell us about when and how investigators will submit these plans to NIH?
Great question. And we're in the process of preparing comprehensive instructions, which will be incorporated into the next version of the NIH application guide this fall that will describe this in more detail. For now, we have issued a guide notice describing implementation details for the DMS policy, which summarizes the changes that will be made to the grant application forms to accommodate the new DMS plan.
And Cindy, previously, data sharing plans were included in the resource sharing part of the application. Is that not the case anymore?
That's right, Elise. The resource sharing plans field is not going away. That will remain to support other policies, namely the research tools and model organism sharing policies. We will be updating the instructions in the NIH application guide to clarify that separate data sharing plans and genomic data sharing plans will no longer be attached to the resource sharing plans field. For any applications that are also subject to the genomic data sharing policy, you'll no longer submit a separate genomic data sharing plan. This information will be addressed as part of your data management and sharing plan. So for competing applications subject to the DMS policy, applicants will need to include a data management and sharing plan. This DMS plan will be attached to the Other Plans field, which will be a new field added to the Forms H version of the PHS 398 Research Plan Form and the PHS 398 Career Development Award Supplemental Form. This new Other Plans field is where you will submit a single PDF attachment containing the elements of a DMS plan. As I just mentioned, we will be providing a recommended format or template to help prepare this attachment. A fillable version of that format page will be made available by the fall.
And so can you talk to us about what NIH will do with these plans after they're submitted, and will they be made public?
NIH did indicate in the published DMS policy that we may make DMS plans publicly available, and we may do so in the future, but we do not anticipate making plans publicly available for initial policy implementation. We did indicate in the policy that DMS plans should not include proprietary or private information, so we do want to remind folks about this, even if the plans aren't made public initially.
Thanks, Cindy. So now I want to move on to discussing where investigators should be sharing their data. Julia, can you talk to us about where and how to share data?
Yes, the policy does not require the use of any specific repository, but NIH institutes and centers for specific programs may go beyond the policy and designate specific repositories. The DMS policy strongly encourages the use of established repositories because depositing data in a quality repository generally improves the fairness, that is the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of those data. NIH provides a supplemental information guide notice titled Selecting a Repository for Data Resulting from NIH-Sponsored Research, which outlines 12 characteristics of data repositories that researchers should be looking for when selecting a repository through which to share their NIH-funded research data. The notice also lists additional characteristics which apply to human data repositories. Additional information is available on the sharing.nih.gov website.
Thanks. And do you have any advice on how to identify the most appropriate repository and sort of where to start in that process?
To help investigators get started, NIH maintains listings of unrestricted access and controlled access NIH-supported repositories, and these are available on the sharing.nih.gov website. For example, there's a searchable table of NIH Institute and Center-supported repositories that should help you learn more about the various NIH repositories and narrow down your options. This table can be sorted by funding IC, name of repository, keyword, and even certain repository characteristics. We also provide some useful information about non-NIH repositories, including links to common generalist repositories and other resources to help investigators navigate the landscape of repository options on the website.
Thanks, Julia. I'm sure our audience will find these resources very useful. Can we talk a little bit about timing for sharing? When should investigators share the data that they generate?
The DMS policy expects scientific data to be made accessible as soon as possible. Specifically, data should be shared at the earlier of two time points, either no later than the publication date of an associated peer-reviewed publication or by the end date of the performance period for the award that generated the data. So what that means is that for scientific data underlying a peer-reviewed publication, those data should be shared no later than the date on which the article is first made available in print or electronic form. That also means that scientific data not disseminated through a peer-reviewed publication should be shared no later than at the end of the performance period. For example, scientific data may underlie unpublished findings or findings documented within preprints, conference proceedings, or book chapters. Additionally, data underlying null and negative findings are important to share even though these key findings are not always published. In those cases, the data should be made available no later than the end of the performance period, the award generating the data. Elise, I do want to better define the end of the performance period in two specific scenarios. First, in instances where a no-cost extension is granted, the recipient should share the data by the end of the extended performance period if such sharing has not occurred previously. Second, if a competitive renewal is submitted, researchers should submit an updated data management sharing plan, revising the data sharing timelines as needed to address any scientific data that were not shared during the initial award period. If the competitive renewal is not successful, applicants will still have to comply with the timeline in the approved DMS plan from the initial performance period. There is an FAQ on the sharing.nih.gov website with more detailed information to help you understand and plan for the timing of data sharing.
Thanks. And for how long does NIH expect the data to be made available for once it is shared?
Great question. The DMS policy does not specify a required period of time for sharing data, recognizing that the appropriate length of time will differ across scientific disciplines. Often other entities, such as data repositories and journals, will have their own guidelines, and there may also be applicable record retention requirements that need to be considered to inform minimum timelines for data sharing.
Thanks. Let's shift now to talking about costs and budgeting. What kind of things can investigators put into budget requests related to data management and sharing? Cindy, this question's for you.
NIH recognizes that making data accessible and reusable for other researchers may incur costs, and you are allowed to request funding to support the data management and sharing activities described in your DMS plan. NIH has published supplemental policy information outlining categories of allowable costs associated with data management and sharing, which was published as a guide notice and has been incorporated into the NIH sharing website. You can include reasonable costs to support data management and sharing in your budget requests. This includes funding for activities such as curating data and developing supporting documentation. For example, formatting data according to accepted community standards, de-identifying data, preparing metadata, and formatting data for a repository. Another type of allowable cost is preserving and sharing data through repositories. and this could include costs such as data deposition fees necessary for making data available and accessible. Other types of allowable costs include those related to local data management considerations, such as activities necessary to manage and preserve data before they are deposited into an established repository.
Is there anything that folks should keep in mind not to include in these budgets?
There are some types of costs that should not be included in your data management and sharing budget, such as general infrastructure costs not associated with a specific project, which are typically included in indirect costs, as well as costs associated with the routine conduct of research, such as gaining access to research data. You'll need to make sure that costs are not double charged or inconsistently charged as both direct and indirect costs. It's also important to note that any cost must be incurred during the performance period, even for scientific data that will be preserved and shared beyond the award period. For example, if your DMS plan proposes preserving and sharing scientific data for 10 years in an established repository with a data deposition fee, the cost for that entire 10-year period must be paid prior to the end of the period of performance. And you can find more details about allowable costs on the Budgeting for Data Management and Sharing page of the NIH Sharing website.
And Cindy, can you walk us through where these data sharing costs should be submitted in the application?
The direct costs to support the activities proposed in your DMS plan must be indicated as data management and sharing costs, and the location where this dollar amount will be indicated varies depending on whether you're submitting a detailed budget or a modular budget. For detailed budgets, the DMS costs will be broken out as a separate line item in Section F, Other Direct Costs. You will use a blank line and enter the appropriate label of data management and sharing costs along with the dollar amount. For modular budgets, there are no line items, so this information will be embedded as text within the additional narrative justification, which is one of the budget justification attachments. In addition to the actual dollar amount, you'll also include a brief summary of the DMS plan and a description of the requested DMS costs within the budget justification attachment. Instructions with more details about exactly what to include here will be available by the fall. Again, the location varies depending on whether the applicant is submitting a detailed budget or a modular budget. For detailed budgets, you'll include this information as part of the budget justification attachment alongside justifications for other types of costs. This is an existing attachment. The change here is that now DMS costs will also need to be justified. For modular budgets, you will include this information as part of the additional narrative justification. I want to highlight that both the dollar amount and the brief justification will be part of the same attachment. This is also an existing attachment, which will be repurposed to support the DMS policy.
Thanks, Cindy. So I want to switch gears a little here. What can you tell us about how DMS plans will be evaluated?
DMS plans will be assessed for appropriateness by NIH program staff at the proposed NIH Institute or Center, who will be looking at whether the plan addresses the elements outlined and the reasonableness of those responses. This is the responsibility of program staff, not peer reviewers. The same guide notice that we just issued on DMS implementation details also summarizes processes for peer review and plan assessment by program staff. Because peer reviewers will not be reviewing DMS plans, they will not see the full DMS plans or be providing comments on those plans.
So Cindy, what is the role of peer review in all of this?
In terms of data management and sharing, peer reviewers will focus only on whether the budget request for data management and sharing is reasonable. Peer reviewers will review the budget for data management and sharing costs alongside a brief summary of the DMS plan and a description of DMS costs, which will provide the details and context that peer reviewers will need to determine if the budget is reasonable for the activities proposed. Unlike the DMS plan attachment, this DMS budget and budget justification information will be available to peer reviewers to provide the necessary context for their review of the budget.
Thank you. And Totten, I've got a question for you. We hear a lot of folks wondering, well, how exact must my plans be if I haven't even done the research yet? Can you speak to this concern?
So I want to point out that one of the basic motivations of this policy is to get applicants thinking about and planning for data management and data sharing as early as possible. We've seen a number of complications that can arise when data sharing is only addressed once research is already underway. That's why we expect the data management and sharing plan to be submitted at the earliest moment, that is, with the application for funding, so that potential issues can be identified and planned for. However, we recognize that you may not know everything about the potential scientific data to be generated when preparing your application. The expectation is that you provide in your data management and sharing plan as much information as possible that reflects your proposed research and demonstrates that you plan for managing and sharing your data to the best of your ability. We've indicated that plans that simply say "to be determined" are not a sufficient level of detail.
Thanks. And Cindy, can you talk to us about what happens if NIH program staff review the plan, but it's not acceptable? Is there an opportunity to revise?
Yes. While a DMS plan must be approved prior to award, we do want to give applicants the chance to provide any additional details that NIH needs in order to approve their plan. Depending on the outcome of that programmatic assessment of your DMS plan that I just described, it may be necessary to communicate with NIH staff to resolve any issues and potentially to provide a revised DMS plan. This will occur through the standard just-in-time process, and you would work with the program officer or grants management specialist to resolve any issues that prevent the funding institute or center from approving your plan based on the information provided.
And Taunton, are there any opportunities for researchers to update plans over the course of a project?
Yes, researchers can make updates to their data management and sharing plan during regular reporting intervals, but they can also update their plan at any other time if needed in response to new developments. For example, if the research plan changes to take a new scientific direction, if a new, better option for sharing data becomes available, such as a new repository, or if a revision to the timeline of the project becomes necessary. Changes to the data management and sharing plan will need to be approved by the NIH Institute, Center, or office funding the research.
Thanks. So it's clear that data sharing requires work and it's an investment. Taunton, can you talk to us about what kind of benefits we expect to see?
First off, we all benefit from greater rigor and greater transparency in publicly funded research. But there are several potential direct benefits for researchers who share data that I'll highlight. First, there's a growing body of research published over the past several years suggesting that sharing data underlying published research can actually increase the citation of those publications, particularly when data are shared through repositories. Additionally, sharing data, especially in ways that are consistent with the FAIR principles, that is, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is another way to demonstrate your productivity and get credit for your contributions, and there are increasing options for the citation of data sets themselves. Importantly, sharing data can also create opportunities for future collaborations and may, in turn, provide you with access to data and resources you might not otherwise have had.
Thanks. And Cindy, can you talk to us about any incentives that exist for sharing data?
That's a great question and really comes back to one of the goals of the policy, a cultural shift toward greater data stewardship and transparency, and one in which shared data can help to advance rigorous and reproducible research. To make that happen, we do want to encourage the use of data citation to incentivize data sharing. So shared data can be cited as products of award and claimed as products of NIH funding. These data can be cited anywhere other research products are cited, including in the bibliography, biosketch, and in the progress report. NIH will be clarifying that the information relevant to reporting preprints and other interim research products also applies to data, and we'll be issuing a guide notice on this topic in the near future. We'll also be updating the RPPR questions to ensure that award recipients are reporting their progress implementing their DMS plan, which may include citing data sets that you have generated and shared as a product of your award. Persistent unique identifiers can help make it easier to find and access shared data sets, and they can also help make it easier for other researchers who end up reusing those data to cite them. Looking ahead to a future of improved data sharing, being able to track data reuse would certainly help to incentivize good data sharing practices so that researchers can show how the data they generated have been reused and are accelerating future research directions.
Thanks. And Julia, can you elaborate more about these persistent unique identifiers? Are these required and should they be included in data sharing plans?
So the use of a persistent unique identifier is not required, but is strongly encouraged. Data management sharing plans should describe whether or not persistent unique identifiers will be used in the data preservation, access, and timelines element of the plan. After funding, unique identifiers may also be reported in annual progress reports.
Thanks. And Cindy, back to you. Can you talk to us about any consequences if an investigator does not adhere to the DMS plan?
So first, I do want to acknowledge that we understand this will be new to many. We want to help you understand how to comply. With that said, NIH will be monitoring whether award recipients follow through with the plans they proposed in their approved DMS plan. After an award is made, the award recipient is required to implement the approved DMS plan, which will become a term and condition of award. They must also report on their progress doing so in the annual RPPRs. As I mentioned earlier, we will be updating the RPPR questions to ask for this information. NIH staff will review this information on an annual basis to verify that the award recipient is complying with the approved DMS plan before issuing a non-competing award. Failure to comply with the approved DMS plan may result in an enforcement action, including additional special terms and conditions or termination of the award, and it may affect future funding decisions.
Thanks. And Julia, this question's for you. We know that DMS is not the only sharing policy at NIH. Can you walk us through what investigators should do if they're subject to multiple policies?
The sharing.nih.gov site has a tool that researchers can use to determine which NIH-wide data sharing policies apply to their proposals. I want to point out that applications that are subject to both DMS and GDS policies should address the expectations and requirements of both policies within a single data management and sharing plan. The DMS policy establishes the foundation for NIH's data management and sharing expectations, which NIH institutes, centers, and offices and programs may choose to add to in order to meet their programmatic needs. For instance, designating repositories for data deposition or specifying particular data collection standards. Additionally, individual funding opportunity announcements may also include expectations related to data sharing. The sharing website also has a searchable listing of institute and center policies to help make researchers aware of additional expectations maintained by funding ICs. Finally, researchers and award recipients are advised to consult with the funding NIH IC on how to comply with all applicable data sharing policies potentially affecting their NIH-supported research project.
Thank you. So kind of wrapping us up here, given all of this information, Taunton, can you talk to us about any tips for how folks should be preparing for this new policy?
So attending this webinar is a great first step, but there's a number of other things that researchers and institutions can be doing to prepare. First, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the resources available on sharing.nih.gov, many of which have already been mentioned today. These include further explanations of the data management and sharing policy, instructions for writing a data management and sharing plan and information on budgets, and resources for helping to identify repositories. There's also frequently asked questions about the policy to help clarify expectations in common situations. You could also watch for additional announcements from NIH as this page will be updated regularly. Second, an important step you can take is to start identifying individuals within your institution that might have relevant roles and responsibilities that you may want to consult in developing a data management and sharing plan, such as data librarians, and to learn about what resources might exist within your institution that could be able to assist you, such as data management and sharing platforms. Many institutions are already preparing for implementing this policy, and your institution may have specific approaches that you should be aware of, and they may also have additional educational and training resources. Remember that data sharing is not new, and you may want to seek out existing sources of expertise. Third, once you've identified relevant individuals, resources, and practices at your institution, I recommend trying to actually draft a data management and sharing plan for your research based on the elements of a plan that NIH has provided. the odds are good that you've been subject to a data sharing expectation in the past, either from NIH or another source. And if so, you might consider reviewing your past data sharing practices and considering what you may need to update in the future for the new policy. Last, there are opportunities to get involved with the community and learn how others are planning to make this change. For example, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology has been hosting a series of competitions for developing data management and sharing plans and demonstrating data sharing successes, and they're offering cash prizes.
Thanks. So this brings us to the end of our panel discussion. We hope you found this information useful, but we also know that you probably have more questions. So we're bringing you our expert panel live to take additional questions. Hi all, welcome back. Thank you for the panel discussion. I did want to make a few notes. Looks like we've got a lot of great questions coming in. Our team has been behind the scenes, kind of combing through those questions and queuing them up for us to be asked very shortly. So thank you so much. Looks like we had, a little bit of technical difficulties with our chat, and we apologize for that. And we heard some people had some issues with screen size. So our apologies. We do want to let everybody know that the recording of this will be made available, and the links that we've been chatting out, and the resource slides that we've been showing you. So hopefully if anything was missed, you can go back to it, and we really appreciate you joining us. So like I said, we're actually going to bring on some additional NIH staff to help answer some of the great questions that we received during the session. I would like to welcome Xanthia James, Cherno Berry, Kasima Garst, and Carrie Mitchell from the Office of Extramural Research. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And thank you all for submitting your questions through the Q&A box. We've been compiling them, and we're going to try and get through as many as possible. All right, let's switch to our first question. Taunton, can you talk to us about the main differences between the new policy and the 2003 data sharing policy?
Sure, thank you. So I think the main difference between the 2003 data sharing policy and the 2020 data management and sharing policy is that the 2003 policy applied to applications that were seeking $500,000 per year or more. While the 2020 data management and sharing policy is not limited and does not have a cost threshold in it. So it applies much more broadly. I think the other important distinction between the two is that the data sharing policy really only expected the submission of a relatively simple data sharing plan and didn't have as much sort of detail in the expectations for what we would expect people to be describing to NIH.
Great, thank you. And Ton, next question for you also. Can you address some of the expectations around sharing qualitative data?
Yes, sir. I think in terms of qualitative data, so the policy does apply to studies that potentially generate qualitative data if the qualitative data in question meet the definition of scientific data, which is defined in the policy as the data that are of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings. Qualitative data are often shared, and there are existing repositories that can accept qualitative data. But just as we've said for other kinds of scientific data, we've provided a number of sort of justifiable limitations and additional considerations for sharing that would also be applicable for qualitative data. I do want to point out, and I think this was mentioned during the webinar as well, that we have published for public comment earlier this year a draft framework for protecting research participant privacy while sharing data, and we'll be finalizing that framework and discussing privacy protections in more detail in the second webinar.
Great, thank you. We received a few questions about sharing software, particularly code that maybe an investigator wrote themselves. Does that fall under what we expect to be shared?
So the data management and sharing policy does not expect researchers to attempt to maximize sharing of software or code, either that are used in the research or that are the products of research itself. I do want to point out, however, that in the elements of a data management and sharing plan, there is an element that relates to software or code that would be necessary to access or to actually use the data itself. So there's an expectation that people would disclose if there are such tools or such software or code, and where they can be found and if they will be sort of made available. I do want to also point out, sort of separate from this, the NIH recently published a set of frequently asked questions about best practices for sharing software and code in those instances when software and code are shared.
Thank you. All right, we're going to get to a couple of questions about repositories and selecting the appropriate repository. So Julia, I'm going to have you kind of kick these off. So the first question is with regards to generalist repositories like Figshare. If folks are already using that, should folks be looking for other kind of more specific discipline, specific repositories? Or is it okay to continue to use those generalist repositories?
So that's a really good question. And the policy does not differentiate or express any preferences for which repositories investigators should use. So it really comes down to investigators thinking about the considerations, practical considerations that are important in selecting a repository, and for repositories that meet the kinds of criteria that we discussed earlier. So it really comes down to which repositories investigators feel can best handle their data and can best maximize its usability and fair principles, and also in terms of resources and budget, which combination of repositories make sense given the scope of the project.
Wonderful, thank you. A follow-on question, what about very large data sets, imaging, genomic data? Some repositories may not be able to handle, the size and the file types. What should folks be thinking about?
So I think that the ecosystem for repositories is constantly changing. And so I think for discipline specific, for different data specific types, it is possible to find repositories that can handle that data, and also discuss with project officers different options for particular data types and where best to share and make this accessible.
Wonderful. And one of the resources that you mentioned earlier, that NIH actually has a kind of sortable, filterable list of repositories that NIH maintains. And so if folks are looking for a place to start, that could be a great place to look at. And there's also some lists there. So, as you said, the ecosystem is large and it's constantly changing, but we're trying to help people navigate that as much as possible. And the lists are on the sharing website. And maybe our trustee colleague can pop in the link to that in the chat for folks. All right, another question, Julia, about some repositories. Let's see. What if the data that is generated can't be shared during a repository? For example, it can't be de-identified. But maybe it could be shared with a data use agreement and, shared sort of under other auspices that are not within a repository. Can you talk about what folks should be considering and how many years maybe the institution must retain this data?
So the policy is really flexible in how data is most appropriately shared for given projects. And so the data management plan should discuss, given the potential limitations for a specific project, what the best proposed plan for sharing the project might be. In terms of how long data should be shared, that really depends on a number of considerations. If it's shared in a repository, particular repositories may have their own best practices. Institutions might also have their own policies with requirements for maintaining data and records, and there might be other applicable laws and regulations. So there are a lot of different considerations that can drive how long data should be shared.
Thank you.
Not an easy answer for that one.
Thank you. We're going to switch to sort of funding and budgets. Cindy, I'm going to direct these to you. Let's see. If expenses to maintain the infrastructure will extend beyond the infrastructure for sharing data will expend beyond the project period, how should people consider kind of putting in budget and funding requests for that type of cost?
Sure. Yeah, good question. And, as Julia just mentioned, in terms of what that timing would be, that's really flexible and left up to what makes sense for each project. But yes, there would certainly be cases, probably most cases, when you would want to share data beyond the project period to ensure that the data you generated do remain useful. And so in that case, all costs to support the sharing, repository fees, for example, those must be incurred during the performance period. And that includes for scientific data that will be preserved and shared beyond the award period. As an example, if your DMS plan proposes to preserve and share scientific data for 10 years in an established repository that does have a data deposition fee, the cost for that entire 10-year period must be paid prior to the end of the period of performance. And I would like to turn to our colleagues in Opera to see if they have any additional details to add on that point.
Hi, this is Xanthia James with Opera. We don't have any additional comments to provide. I think you covered it fairly well.
And sort of a follow-on for you, Cindy, you mentioned allowable and unallowable costs and certain things like infrastructure to kind of conduct the research versus something that's very specific, like a repository fee. Did you want to kind of elaborate, what are those distinctions?
So yeah, when you're thinking about an overall budget for your project, you will need to think about the different activities that you'll need to do to preserve and share your data. And some of that is really specific to your project, that's most likely going to be the direct cost that you'll be including in your budget request. But there might be other types of costs that, if your institution has resources available, institutional data librarians, for example, who are, helping across projects, that might be funded out of your institution's indirect costs. And I know we can't, answer every individual question about different situations, but generally it's project specific data management and sharing costs versus, institutional overhead costs that are spread across multiple projects. Hopefully that's helpful. And again, my Opera colleagues might be able to add some more specific details about how those costs could be determined.
Yes, Cindy, I agree with what you just expressed. And I also want to add that we just want the applicants to keep in mind that you just need to be, however you want to account for those costs, you just need to be consistent in how you're applying direct and indirect costs throughout your budget and also as it applies to your DMS costs.
Great, thank you. One more question about funding. Will NIH be funding, larger amounts of money per award to account for these costs?
Sure. So yeah, we're definitely, understanding that this is going to be a new thing for many to think about these costs separately. And we do just want to make you aware that NIH does provide, many resources to support data management and sharing generally. This includes in the form of repositories, tools, and sometimes funding opportunities to support data sharing in certain cases. And NIH will continue to assess data management and sharing costs to determine appropriate resources as needed in the future. This question also, makes me think of some questions that I think we've been getting about whether NIH will be, raising different caps or thresholds and limits. And on that question, I do want to turn to Opera to provide any insight.
Yes, Cindy, as you mentioned, this is a new policy. We're using this initial year to kind of, work out the kinks and assess how we're going to move forward. So with that being said, our NIH is currently finalizing its strategies for how we're going to address additional costs that either may be incurred either during the project period or after the project period, and we'll provide more formal guidance on that in the near future.
Thank you. We have a few questions about research involving humans. So Julia, I'm going to address this first question to you. DMS plans do ask about some things that are included in something that would be reviewed by your IRB. Should folks be working with their IRBs ahead of applying, ahead of creating their DMS plan? What would you suggest?
So that's a really good question. So NIH doesn't require that IRBs review DMS plans, but certainly part of the discussion in the elements of the plan will include consideration of any limitations to data sharing. And often those limitations come from informed consent or might come from IRB review. So as investigators develop those plans, if there's any questions about what are the appropriate applicable limitations, that's a good time to reach out to the IRB for clarification and for discussion. And another time point to do that too is in developing informed consent forms and thinking about what might be appropriate language to describe future data sharing. And NIH issued in May 2022 some sample informed consent language related to data sharing and future use of data. That's a good resource for that. But that's another point in time that investigators could consider talking with IRBs as well.
Thank you, Julia. Taunton, this next question is for you. How does NIH intend to approach data sharing requirements when working with sovereign native nations? I know that you've been developing some additional guidance on that.
Sure. So I think there's actually several relevant provisions in the policy and in related guidance for when researchers are actually working with tribes. First, I want to sort of repeat what's in the policy and in the guidance and say that NIH respects and recognizes tribal sovereignty and American Indian and Alaska Native the concerns that those communities sometimes have with data sharing. And we've indicated through an FAQ to the policy that justifiable limitations on data sharing do include when there are explicit tribal laws, regulations, or policies that would prohibit or would limit disclosure of data in some way. Earlier this year, NIH actually proposed additional considerations for when working with tribes in a draft supplemental information on responsible management and sharing of those data. And as was mentioned during the webinar, a central tenet of these proposed considerations is to facilitate respectful partnership and mutually agreed upon data management and sharing practices, which may ultimately require limitations on sharing in some of those cases. And we're actually working to finalize this document, and we plan to address these factors in more detail in a second webinar.
Thanks, Taunton. And another question for you. Will there be additional guidance on controlled access sharing and associated data use agreements?
Sure. So alongside that draft supplemental information that was published earlier this year, there's actually a second one on protecting research participant privacy that goes into a little bit more detail about what NIH is thinking in terms of what would constitute sort of best practices and operational principles for sharing human research participant data, and does try and actually provide a set of considerations for when it would be warranted to share data through a controlled access mechanism, and some thoughts also on the use of data use agreements. So we'll be finalizing that later this year as well, and also trying to take that up in more detail in the second webinar too.
Thank you. Let's see, Cindy, next question is for you. What about a competitive renewal? Are there any implications for what happens to data from that were under the prior award period?
Sure. So yeah, for those projects where you have an ongoing award, you won't be expected retroactively to satisfy this policy. When you come under the policy is when you are coming in for a competitive renewal. And in that case, we do expect you to propose a data management and sharing plan. And the policy is quite flexible. So we'd like you to think on what data you will be generating, and for projects that have been ongoing and generated some data and will continue to add to that, you might need to think through that a little differently than a completely new project. But the idea is that we're looking for proactive planning. And so when you're coming in for the next segment, then think about the data that you'll be generating and whether there are any considerations about the data you have already generated that you'll continue to use. So I guess it's a little hard to answer that because it will vary depending on the situation. But the idea is that looking ahead, you'll be considering what data you might be appropriate to share.
Thanks. And another question for you, Cindy. What about the allowability of hyperlinks in a DMS plan? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So hyperlinks are not allowed per policy unless that they're specifically noted in a particular funding opportunity announcement or a form field instructions. And so that means that we will, not be looking for hyperlinks, and you should not include hyperlinks in your DMS plans. Where you'll more likely be telling us about what you've generated and where it's shared would be the RPPR. So while you shouldn't have hyperlinks in your initial DMS plan, once that's been approved and you start generating and sharing data, we certainly want to hear about the progress in doing so. And so you can, point to where shared data might be located in your progress reports, but due to the hyperlink policy, we do not want you to include those links in your DMS plan.
Great, thank you. Cindy, another one for you. You've mentioned in applicability that training and fellowship would be excluded from this policy. Can you clarify, if these folks will in fact be generating scientific data, will they still have to propose these DMS plans, or are they not required to be submitting these plans?
So if you are coming in with a training or a fellowship application, you will not be submitting a DMS plan. And that's because the purpose of training and fellowship programs is to support training rather than research. And so consistent with other NIH data sharing policies, the T's and the F's will not be subject to the DMS policy. Training programs, support stipends, tuition fees, training related expenses, travel, facilities, and administrative costs. And fellowship programs for stipends, tuition fees, training related expenses, and childcare. So these are not research focused, and therefore they're not subject to the DMS policy. And so as both the T's and the F's do not support the generation of scientific data, they will not be subject to this policy. And in general, I've seen a number of questions coming in about certain specific activity codes, and NIH will continue to review the full scope of activity codes and will update FAQs accordingly to communicate which ones are subject to the policy and which are not. And we will provide more information on the sharing.nih.gov website when that is available.
Thanks, Cindy. And a question, let's give this one to Taunton regarding the timing of sharing. So must data be shared upon the first publication, or is it acceptable to share data once all publications have been, I guess, submitted and approved?
Sure. So the data management and sharing policy indicates that data should be shared by the time of the publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Otherwise, it can be shared by the end of the period of performance of the award.
Great. So in this case, it would be the first time you publish on it. That's your time point.
That's right.
Great. Let's see, Cindy, a cost question for you. Are DMS costs excluded from the $250K modular limit or the $500K limit for prior approval?
I'll turn this question to Opera.
Hi, we will have to follow up with that question. That's a question we'll have to follow up with, and we'll provide an answer during our in our FAQs on that. So thank you for providing that question.
Great, thank you. The next question is sort of about compliance. Cindy, who is responsible for confirming that the PI has complied with the plan? Is it NIH or is it the institution?
Sure. So in terms of compliance with the plan, what we are looking for is that what you indicated in your version of the plan that was approved, that you have followed through with that. And what exactly will be looked at will vary, but generally we're expecting that you'll put things like timelines for generating and depositing data in repositories, that type of thing. And so on an annual basis, as part of the RPPR annual reporting process, we'll be asking the recipients to report on their progress implementing their specific DMS plan. And then the NIH staff that oversee that award will be looking at that information and seeing whether you did do what you said you would, and working with you in case there are any challenges. And if anything changes over time, then you would have the opportunity to update your plan as appropriate. And in terms, if there's a specific question of who's responsible for that, NIH staff will certainly monitor your compliance, but we're also asking in your plan for you to indicate who at your institution will be responsible for looking at things from your side. So it really is a partnership there.
Thank you, Cindy. So Taunton, this next question is for you. Will data sharing plans be made public, for example, in Reporter or some other way?
Well, I actually might defer this question to Cindy, who I think addressed it in the webinar. Cindy, is there anything you want to add there?
Sure, just that we are, looking to learn the best way to do this. We would like to make these public in a way that makes the most sense and make sure that helps individuals locate data in case they want to use that in their research, for example. And so we're going to be looking at the plans we receive and thinking about how that information can be made available and where would make the most sense to do that. So that remains open, but we're definitely interested in that.
Thank you. Another question about sample plans. Will there be samples available? Let's see, Taunton, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So there's a number of efforts going on that I think are pertinent to this. So first off, I think I mentioned during the webinar that there is actually sort of a effort going on underneath FASEB that involves prizes for actually developing sample plans for different types of work, as well as prizes related to sort of large data sharing projects as well. So I would definitely encourage you to look into things like that. In terms of what NIH is doing, there is a number of sample plans that actually have been made publicly available. So on the NIMH website, for example, there are some there in terms of research that might fall within their category that would also be subject to the data management and sharing policy. I think there is an interest. It's certainly something, a question that we hear from time to time. So we may be providing more resources like that, across the agency as well.
Thank you. Taunton, another question for you. What about negative data that are generated during a project that really aren't going into a publication? Will those be up for sharing?
Sure. So I think the policy was pretty clear back when it was published in October 2020 that NIH did want to include, things like null results and data that underlie those as part of this policy. So if they're not published, it would be expected to be shared by the end of the period of performance.
Thanks. Let's see, a question on consent. What if participants do not want their data shared and must, a participant agree to having their data kind of shared before participating in the research? See, Julia, would you like to take this one?
Sure. So, this is something that really is described and indicated in the protocol and in informed consent documents. So it should be very clear in informed consent documents whether participation in a particular project involves sharing of data or does not. And often consent forms will have options for which critical aspects of participating in protocol are required and which are not required and are optional. And sometimes having data shared in the future could be optional, but it really is something that is specific to a particular protocol and is described in the informed consent.
Great, thanks. And Julia, another question. Is a preprint considered published with regards to the sort of the time point of sharing?
So in the description of the time point, the policy describes that sharing through a peer-reviewed publication in whatever format that publication comes through would be the time point for sharing data underlying that publication.
Okay, so we would say preprint, not peer-reviewed, does not kind of satisfy that time point.
Correct.
Let's see, Cindy, this question is for you. What might happen if the DMS plan submitted might not be complete, or the NIH may not deem it fully acceptable?
Yeah, great question. And so, we do want to provide as many resources as we can now and point you to folks at your institution who could help you write a good DMS plan the first time. But we do understand this will be a learning period at first, as this is a new activity you might not have done before. And so depending on the information you do provide in your DMS plan with your application, when the program staff assigned to your application is assessing the content there, they're going to be looking at your information there to ensure that the elements of the DMS plan have been adequately addressed and to assess the reasonableness of those responses. And so depending on what they find there, if they're missing information and they're unable to determine if that is reasonable or not, then you would expect NIH staff to reach out to you during the just-in-time process to ask for clarification, and in some cases that they might ask for a revised DMS plan, and that you would work together to get your DMS plan complete so that it can be approved. And applications selected for funding will only be funded when program staff determine that the DMS plan is complete and acceptable.
Thanks so much. It looks like we have probably time for just one more question or a couple more questions before we wrap up. So there's a question about sharing data that doesn't have sort of a best practice, or that may be useful but not necessary to sort of replicate a finding. Are there anything, Don, can you speak to us about sort of what folks should consider in terms of using a repository, open access repository, versus sort of keeping that data on an institutional server and making it available as needed?
Sure. So I think there's two questions here. First about maybe whether there aren't best practices or standards for sharing data, and second, data that maybe perhaps don't meet the definition of scientific data in the policy. So in the first case, we would generally speaking expect people to describe sort of anticipated standards that you'll be using when sharing data. You can indicate, though, that there are no sort of consensus standards, within your scientific field for actually applying to the data that you're proposing to share. But again, that's for scientific data. So in the case where you have sort of other data that might not meet the definition of scientific data, perhaps because it's not necessary to replicate or validate research findings, the policy would not, generally speaking, expect those to be shared, or to be sort of addressed in plans. There's nothing that prevents you from being able to share those as well. And I do want to point out that there are other NIH policies, such as the NIH genomic data sharing policy, which may actually expect sharing of data that could have a potentially broader scope than the data management and sharing policy. So there may be other expectations that would expect those data to be shared, but this policy would not necessarily expect them to do so.
Hi, this is Anthea. I also wanted to jump in and add that our policy also states that when it's a situation where it's scientific data that's not leading to the generation of a publication, it's expected to be shared, but we just ask that you share it by the end of the award period, as opposed to data that is actually leading to the generation of a publication. That's expected to be shared as soon as possible and no later than the time of the associated publication.
Right, and just to clarify, that's for data that meet the definition of scientific data. But there may be some cases where you have, additional data types that might not meet that definition.
All right, thank you guys. We've got just 4 minutes left. I hope that the questions that we did get to were useful. I just wanted to wrap us up by pointing out a few resources that we have to share with you all. So we've been shouting out links and referencing the NIH Scientific Data Sharing website. That's a great place to start. We have populated that with all the information that we have at this time point. And it's something that we will be continually updating. So for example, we're pushing new FAQs and updated FAQs very regularly. I believe I have a slide to show if whoever is controlling the slides there, that would be great. Thank you. Let's see. We also have a dedicated inbox for questions about data sharing. So the sharing@nih.gov is our dedicated inbox if folks are having questions. We do also want to encourage folks to reach out to program officers and program staff if there's proposal specific questions, and utilize your institutional resources, for example, data librarians, data managers, and folks in your sponsored programs offices. Let's see, we do want to plug our webinar number 2. We're going to be diving deeper into topics. So September 22nd, go ahead and register. It's a separate registration than this event, and we're going to be tackling some follow-on topics here. We also wanted to close by saying, we're committed to keeping you folks in the loop, as much as possible. So we wanted to plug some of our blogs and listservs and where to follow us on social media, because, there has been a lot of movement on this topic recently. And we know that we are planning on putting out some additional resources. So please do follow us and check back in to stay up to date. And with that, I wanted to plug one more event. We are doing a virtual NIH conference that'll be in February, but also has a number of additional sort of pre-conference events. So if you're interested in this topic and others, please check out this useful learning opportunity. And with that, I will close by offering a sincere thank you to our expert panel, our tech support, our captioners, our ASL interpreters, and everyone who made this a useful event. Thank you so much for tuning in. And like I said, we will be making the recording, the links, the slides, everything as available as we can. So do plan to tune in for webinar 2. We can hopefully get to some additional topics. So thank you so much.